Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet this afternoon, the Wurundjeri people, and pay my respects to their elders, both past and present, and pay my respects to any elders that might be with us this afternoon. So this session is probably the biggest one and probably the most complicated to unpack, but I have some very experienced people that will be talking through these very, very complicated issues with me. So it's about racism, identity and panels, and it's unpacking all of that. And joining me to discuss this, I'll start at the end, is Yassir Morsi, and he is a researcher at the International Centre for Muslim and Non-Muslim Understanding at the University of South Australia. Next to Yassir is Luke. Luke Pearson is the founder of Indigenous media organisation Indigenous X. He's an editor, writer, consultant and public speaker. And closest to me is Mridula Nath Chakraborty, who is the Deputy Director of the Monash Asia Institute. Her projects include Australia-India Literature's International Forum and Literary Commons Writing Australia-India in the Asian Century. And in 2016, she co-edited with Kent McCarter a special issue of the Cordite Poetry Review. So please make our panellists feel very welcome. And I guess I structured how I thought this conversation was going to go, but there's a lot that I want to pick up from the last panel because I just think it's only appropriate to begin to unpack it from that perspective. And it's just this idea of centering indigeneity in these conversations and how we think about it. And in terms of how we identify and the importance of that, I don't know who wants to take that on. I don't know if you were here for much of that session, but I think there was, it kept coming up a fair bit, and I think it's something that's worth acknowledging and thinking about. Who wants to meditate on that?
No, I found that question also extremely provocative and productive. And I think I'll take a kind of circuitous route in trying to unpack that idea of where do you look at certain kinds of positionality. So I recently, I moved to Melbourne quite recently, just 3 years ago, and moved to this new neighborhood. And there's this little nature strip outside our house, and we kind of reclaimed it and started doing work on it. And there's a person who lived diagonally across our house who walked past one day and just said to me, shouted at me, "Go back to South Africa." And I remember being taken aback. It's one of the few occasions on which somebody who has been in such proximity, who's not a stranger, who said this to me. But I was also curious to find out that I was not just upset by that go back to South Africa, but I was equally upset at the fact that he had not got the country right. and I just thought, at least get your geography correct or try and understand. And when we were in this session, in the last session, I started thinking about how is it that we position ourselves in terms of our desires, our aspirations, and where we want to be, not just in terms of the structural ways in which race defines people of color. And I have done some work around this, and I have found very useful to think about race as a technology. Race as a technology that manages and maintains discriminations across groups. And race always works as a technology in terms of the hierarchies it establishes in a particular power structure. So my indignation at being identified as South African as opposed to Indian also then revealed to me how invested I was in the category of the nation state, and making the movement from one nation state to another and moving across different kinds of racial technologies that had been applied in different spaces really has led me to think about not what race is, but what race does, what it manages to achieve, how it manages to manage and control populations that are always seen as the other in a certain kind of in a place. So centering indigeneity then becomes a very important way of breaking through a question that also came up in the first panel, which is why is it that whiteness always gets centered in terms of racial race questions, whether it's from people of color coming in this kind of a pyramid structure where white people might be at the top, and then there are different kinds of layers that one has to navigate, or as Luke said in his panel, you always have to go over many, many brown levels before you get to some kind of an authentic blackness. So I think that's how I would put it.
Yeah, when we're talking about centering Indigenous experiences in conversations about race and racism in Australia, I'm probably a little biased, but it makes perfect sense to me that we would do that. And just even beginning events with the idea of an acknowledgement of country, or a welcome to country preferably, but an acknowledgement of country. And you both did really nice ones today, but I often will ask people when we're making that acknowledgement, like, what are we acknowledging when we do that? And just the term itself, traditional owner, is sort of the nicest imaginable way of describing what happens from becoming an owner to becoming a traditional owner, and how distinct they are. And so when we're talking about the impacts of racism, and it's like, I don't know what used to be right here where I stand. I'm not from Melbourne, I'm not of here, and so not just Indigenous experience, but local stories. And I mean, it always worries me when I'm in cities or I'm in places, like, I could be standing on a very sacred place, I could be standing on a very traumatic place, I don't know what happened right here where I stand, and here we are talking about experiences of racism. And there are so many undocumented massacre sites in Australia and sacred sites that it would not be surprising to me at all if I was standing right on top of one. And just the awkwardness of that reality when you're having these conversations, I think we can't ignore that history. We have to privilege those stories and those realities and the ongoing lived experience for many of us. These aren't academic and abstract concepts. So this is our lived experience.
Absolutely. I mean, to answer the question and continue on from what Lucas said, I can't really imagine an anti-racism in this context in Australia that doesn't centre, precisely because of where we are and the language we're speaking and the history that we've inherited, but also because no conversation about racism is ever neutral. Whiteness is by default the centre, and the very notion of centering something else in itself is a contest, and it's not easily done. It's not just about ticking boxes, as it is part and parcel for me as an attempt to make visible the existent erasures that happen, the erasures that you're speaking about, the erasures of erasures, the ability that we don't even know what's been erased. These are all crucial elements of, I think, any standard anti-racism at the most basic level. Forget the restructuring of things, but the way we imagine the problem, the way we speak about the problem, the way we communicate and have conversations about the problem. So to return back to my original point, what anti-racism without centering, remembering, discovering, and making visible the erasures of Indigenous Australia. And to conclude on this point alone, everything I've learnt on an intellectual level can be put aside. This land, this country has sustained my well-being. And it will be easy for me to speak of an anti-racism without acknowledging the embodied experience that I have. And that's one element of a lot of the way we speak about this tends to make it, as you said, abstract, and just to bring it back down to that concrete. Where are we, first and foremost? So in that sense, it's crucial and it's important, and it's essential. In particular because any discussion of whiteness in the Australian context begins first and foremost with what it is erased to become whiteness.
So before we proceed further, I guess in talking about identity and labels and race, I guess, because it will just keep coming up in this conversation, this idea and this definition of whiteness in what we're talking about, how can we define it? How do people get an understanding of what you mean when you talk about centering, that the default is whiteness, for example?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's a shorthand for power first and foremost, but how that power is raced, how that power carries within it cultural norms, a language, a sense of history, but also a missing violence, right? So whiteness for me, yes, look, absolutely. There's a lot of people who tend to shy away from the fact that it relates back to some biological origins, the skin color. No, it has that in its historical repertoire. There's no point denying it. The first and foremost point is I didn't create whiteness. Whiteness, by default of creating itself, created a whole lot of other categories and dispossessed a lot of people from what they are. So it all depends, and with the debate about definitions, for me it's about how well you read a room. It all depends at what point you give and what point you take and what point you stay silent. The easiest definition for me is to talk about these norms, but to talk about it in a way that there's something almost easy to say that it's just a standard, but it's a little harder to say it's a standard built by violence, right? And that difficulty is where the conversation ought to be had. So yeah, it's the standard that we're given. It's the names that it gives itself, and by default gives me and all of us and the rest of us. It is grounded in a particular origin. It does have a familial relationship with Europe and Europeanness and the West and all the signifiers that come with that: reason, democracy, liberty, freedom, all the things that have been stolen from the vast majority of people and relabeled Western. But if I would conclude, it's a conversation, not a definition. I think, and that conversation depends who you're speaking to. And there are key words in that conversation that should always be mentioned: power and violence.
Yeah, and I think not just built on that history of violence, but is still maintained and sustained very actively by violence, not just in language and discourse, but in physical violence. That's still a reality for a lot of people, and fear of the potential of violence. Again, both physical and vocal, and exclusion, access. And again, I think defining it becomes just innately problematic. It's like when someone brings up like a dictionary definition of racism. The job of defining racism or of defining whiteness is not up to lexicographers, who are, traditionally have all been white people who define these terms, and then we refer back to the definitions of. And when we're talking about, whiteness in Australia automatically seems to own concepts of science and art and democracy and all these other things that, for the most part, white people did not invent or create, and the ones they did not do so in isolation and particularly how that's used as a measuring stick against Aboriginal people and Aboriginal history and inventions and technologies and philosophies is the point of like, well, you didn't write down your history on paper, so you don't have a history. And that is said very explicitly in that way. You have prehistory. You didn't have science because there's no such thing as Aboriginal science. There is only science, which is then meant to white people science. And so, just like I've talked before about, the idea of white privilege, white fragility, white everything. It's not the privilege bit or the fragility bit that is so problematic. It is the naming of something as white. And so, all of us are used to giving ourselves qualifiers. I'm an Aboriginal Australian, I'm a this Australian, that Australian, and so many white people go, I'm just Australian. And so being called a white Australian and having the word white talked about is very uncomfortable for people who haven't had to have any label, and that's a challenge. And so I think the more exposure we can give people to that, and it was said in that first panel, it's not saying that you built white supremacy or that you ascribe to it or that you endorse it, but it is a major contributing force to every aspect of everything in this country. And you can't pretend that you live in a vacuum removed from that. And I said, just for me as white appearing, like I access social elements of white privilege every day when I walk out, and a lot of white privilege isn't, people mistake it for class privilege, like, but I didn't grow up rich, I didn't, and it's like, not having a fear of getting pulled over and killed, and then the police who did that not ever coming to justice, like not having that as an active fear in my day-to-day life, that's a privilege that a lot of people don't get. So privileges aren't just, silver platter. Privilege is not living in constant fear of things that other people in my family do live with as a daily reality. So I think, the more people are confronted with that, comfortable or not, they need to be, because it's a real thing.
Mridula, I want to pick up on a point that Luke just mentioned, which is this tendency of non-white people to want to self-identify. Where does that come from, and what does that do? I mean, if you preface your Australianness with either Southeast Asian, South Asian, Black African, whatever that is, why do you think that? Where does that come from?
I think in terms of labeling, a lot of the labels as they exist now are a function of what colonialism did. If Europe had declared itself to be at the center, then everything got measured in terms of their distance from whatever that presumed center was. So there's no reason why Australia is the antipodes and so far away from the center. Or, the Middle East, for example, is not the Middle East for anybody in Australia. So the Middle East is northwest for Australian. So I think these labels that come up are ways of positioning when migrants self-identify in terms of hyphens. I think it's part of, again, this kind of a nexus between colonialism, capitalism, and the nation state, which invests enormous power in the nation state as we know it, the 19th century nation state, and the way in which Australia came into being. So when migrants travel into something called Australia, which is a structure of a nation state from another nation state. There are many migrants who came to Australia when what they knew as their home had been completely demolished. It did not exist in name. It had been completely taken over and planted. But in cases where migrants have come from other nation states that might have existed, I think people of color is very different. People of color, hyphenated people of color identity is very different from saying I'm South Asian or Southeast Asian, because that again is a participation in how empire divided up its loot. Whereas when you identify as a person of color, that is a political position. That's a kind of position which says there are certain kinds of solidarities that exist across nation-state categories. And in this as well, I think it's imperative for people of color to also examine our own positionalities. Just because I'm a person of color doesn't necessarily make me radical by virtue of being a person of color. I may have come from enormous privilege which allowed me entry into this place called Australia. So what does it mean to negotiate that in terms of solidarities and in terms of having an absolutely central acknowledgement of indigeneity? I think if I was to think in terms of South Asia, there would have been very few indigenous people who would have had access to Australia, indigenous people from South Asia who would have had access to Australia. It would be non-indigenous people from South Asia who might have had much greater access to Australia. So to think of the intricateness of those negotiations, of the positionalities that you come from, I think has to be central to the work of anti-racism.
Yeah, so just picking up on what Mridula is saying, how does that then work when you not only have the intersection of race, but you also have the intersection of religion?
Mm-hmm. Well, they're often inseparable in two ways. Historically, racism created what we have come to understand as religion. If we follow the lines of the Assad and Jill Anninger, religion becomes this category post-Enlightenment that often is reduced to the emotive, the spiritual, the metaphysical, the irrational, and which is all tied together by some appeal to authority, right? And so all the parts of religion that overlap with, say, science, and science has become the imperially accredited way of knowing knowledge. So that's one thing, but also religion in many ways helped create what we have come to understand as racism. It would be almost impossible to tell the story of colonialism without telling the story of Christianity and its role in that. So, but it goes back down to this labels issue. I mean, I'm less worried about what label I adopt myself and more about trying to disrupt the power of those naming me at any given moment. So we get dropped into this fishbowl of a language, and I'm supposed to make sense of myself through it. I'm supposed to be at one point. I find myself sometimes reclaiming that I'm Australian. There you go, reclaim Australia. And I don't identify as anything. Like, sometimes it depends who's speaking to me. Those who want to make sure that I know that I know I'm a foreigner, they're like, nah, mate, I'm Aussie, she'll be all right, and I still have my language. And then there are other times where I use the word Islamist because it's inducing of anxiety, right? So I'll be like, assalamu alaikum, right? And so it's more about disrupting those who I'm involved in, who are trying to, because I'm looking for a space. I'm looking to make sense of myself, and you would all know this. Everybody in this audience would know this. Whatever on the hue of racial hierarchy they've put on us, we are we're sense-making creatures. We're looking for meaning. We're contesting. We navigate different spaces. The problem is with racialized minorities is that we have to deal with it in a language that has been weaponized, harmed, and it's not a neutral space for me that I have to figure out what it means to be Muslim in the war on terror. That means all sorts of things. And that's the problem with labeling. I am, it's been mentioned by so many scholars, but even the word black has been dispossessed from black people. It means something. It signifies white for a lot of, the word Muslim in the war on terror also got dispossessed from any meaning that we gave it. Or whoever the we is. So on that, and this comes back to whiteness, and I'll very quickly wrap up, because in one way, it's about that which labels. It's that which races but doesn't like itself to be raced. It's that which is built on the fragility of it can point at us, but we can't point at it, to the point that if there's a Vegemite, halal Vegemite, there's a group of people who want to protest because, look, Vegemite's horrible. Sorry for being... if Sharia creep happens, the Vegemite's low on the... right? So... there's that, and then there's this sigh of inevitability, like, I listened to something recently about the potential of Western Europe in the demise in 100 years through demography. There'll be no more white Europeans, So they're potentially thinking about their demise, while there's almost a inevitable sigh around things like Syria. It happens. And so, in many ways, the labeling issue for me is winning back my right to make sense of myself, and whatever label I use is given to the fact that I'm always trying to point back at that which is pointing at me.
So look, just picking up on what Yassir's talking about, how do we, in terms of thinking about the labels that we put on ourselves and those that are put on us, I am curious in our understanding of blackness in the Australian context, because it is one that we are not having enough conversations about in terms of understanding what it means to be black. And I suppose, what sort of insight would you be able to share on that? When we're talking about blackness in an Australian context, what do we mean? Who does it include? And does anyone have a right to claim blackness?
I think a big part of that is looking at that context and that history. And I mean, you can't help but look in the snapshot of the moment and say, for the majority of times, if we're talking about Black Australia, we mean me and not you. And that's just an awkward moment right there in that snapshot. But when you look at that history, you go, well, of course, that's what that is and where that comes about. And I think particularly in the Indigenous experience in Australia, we have such little understanding of that history and the specific moments of things. I mean, even when we talk about, people of colour, like, we know where that comes from and the room it happened in and the people who put it forward and why. And most people don't know that. In terms like intersectionality, when we're having the debates about, should we say Aboriginal, Indigenous, First Nations, should they get capital letters, like, there's specific histories with all of those. And the same with, White Australia has a black history, Australia as blackness, and then in the global space of, we draw those parallels with America, where Aboriginal people sort of played the parallel for African America and Indigenous America when we aren't either. But we have this need to label and to draw comparisons and parallels. And so I think, like growing up, I always identified as Aboriginal, and then it was just that broader awareness in the space that when someone says Black Australia, they are talking about me. Like, I've never really sort of, growing up, I never identified myself as black. I was Aboriginal because when I was a little kid, Dad said, I'm Aboriginal and so are you, and that was as much thought as I ever really gave it until I started to engage in more political spaces and interact with other people in it. And I think, again, me being categorised as Black Australian, and the term Black Australia meaning specifically Aboriginal Australia in most contexts, isn't something that someone else who is black in Australia and isn't Aboriginal should feel that takes away from their sense of blackness. It's just like, of course that's what it means, because this is where that's come from. And so then having conversations about that and going, well, yes, but I am too, and here's my history within that and positioning in relationship to that, shouldn't be a competitive space. It should just be like, this is why we are where we are. And then do we need to change anything about that? Do we need to broaden? Do we need to contextualise? And I think that's why a lot of Aboriginal people spell black without the C. I think that has a big part of saying, like, we have a unique context of blackness that we're talking about, so we needed to separate that from other global conversations of blackness. So for me, it's one where I can look at that history and go, that makes sense to me. And I fit in that in the same way that a lot of the labels I have and a lot of the context for these conversations, we're not starting those afresh. It's why my generation was raised so aggressively with this idea of not being able to identify as part Aboriginal. Because the generation before us had those labels imposed, through legislation with very detrimental consequences. So for my generation coming up, anyone who ever said I'm part Aboriginal was told very quickly by the generation before us, no, you are Aboriginal or you are not. And I've always found it interesting that only applies if the other part is white. So if there's an Aboriginal person who says I'm half Aboriginal and half Tongan, we go, cool. But if you say I'm half Aboriginal, half white, you get, no, you are not. You are Aboriginal or you are not. And again, it makes perfect sense because it wasn't Tongans who were taking us from our families. It wasn't Tongans who were saying, like, you have to be this, you're a quadroon, you're an octoroon, you're this, you're that. And so, and I wonder, like, with my own children, where they're going to position and how they're going to choose to identify and what my generation is going to put on them through our experiences. And again, there is no right or wrong. Like you were saying, like, sometimes I'll do this, sometimes I'll do that, sometimes I'll demand that I be identified as Gamilaroi, even though most people don't have any context of knowledge of the difference between Gamilaroi or Wiradjuri or anything else. And other times I'm like, just call me whatever, I don't care as long as we get on with doing stuff.
So what about in contexts where the visibility because of skin tone, or if it's religion, for example, if you are a Muslim woman, for example, and you wear a hijab, you are visible based on your identity. How do we then start thinking about that sort of discrimination based on the aesthetics versus how we ourselves choose to identify? Who wants to take that? Mridula, do you want to give it a try?
Sure. I mean, this is again, as Luke and Yassir both have pointed out, there has been a long history of work on these ideas of what you get identified as. And at the heart of it is some kind of a mythical authenticity, some kind of an authentic basket in which people are supposed to fit in. And if you think of then, I'll again come back to that idea of race as a technology which is used to control people. And what this emphasis on visibility, I lived for 10 years in Canada where I was a visible minority. So if you think of the way in which the nation state itself constructs you as something which is a visible minority, then it becomes very problematic to think of somebody who might be from the same background as me but not be visible in the same way. And so then it makes me think of the work of somebody like Patricia Hill Collins, for example, who talks about race as something that at the same time invisibilizes you within structures of behavior, social pattern, the way in which you exist in society, and hyper-visibilizes you in exactly the same moment. When you're being invisibilized in terms of the nation state, that's in terms of your access to any kind of existence as a human being, as a citizen, as somebody who might have something called dignity to call upon, and at the same time hyper-visibilizing you so that you can then fit into categories of the other or the criminal or the unwanted. So I think this emphasis on visibility again is something which takes away from the right of people. I mean, I don't want to use the language of rights. The ability, the creativity of people to express themselves in ways in which they make sense of themselves, as Yassir was saying. But then when you have all of these strictures of race put in, all of these ways in which race controls you, then they become things to identify you and trap you within categories. Which is why categories, I agree with both Luke and Yassir, categories have that positionality, that they give you a space from which to speak of, but they're not absolute terms in any way.
So is there a point when it is good to have racial categories? Is there any benefit in having those categories?
I think so. The point, though, depends on what point you have in the conversation, and often the conversation with yourself, right? So there's a slippery line that we might fall into. We don't want to valorize the white gaze to make it so crucial to our existence that really the job that we're doing is playing optometrist to white gaze in order to fix its understanding of how we are. I think that we have to decenter our sense of self from that gaze. So at points, therefore, you have to kind of scrub, forgive for the analogy, scrub clean all the words that have been associated to you, to reinvent them, to make sense of them. And that's part and parcel of what colonialism does. I mean, we have inherited this language. We've inherited this sense of self. You're absolutely right. I didn't come with a definition of what it meant to be authentically me. Right? I didn't know. The first understanding of Islam for me was the Orientalist one. To the point where I used to get all proud and happy that Aladdin was showing on TV. I was like, yay. Then I'd feel bad after and not realize why. I was just a kid. I didn't know that it was embedded with all sorts of ways to make me feel terrible. Thanks, Disney. But yeah, I think it's important, but it's kind of like what Spivak speaks about, strategic essentialisms. There's a moment where you have to identify with the language of the master to underline, but then there's this of not overdoing it, right? And to borrow a line from Fanon, we have to do it because we've inherited an arsenal of complexes about who we are. And deep embedded in that is that we're constantly chasing our identity through this approval from a white other that has, in that kind of master-slave dialectic. But then the other aspect of that is, to again borrow a line from Salman Said, who said, be careful not to play therapist. It's not about you fixing how they see you. It's not about you being an entertainer, an educator, and so forth. So, yes, important, but for what purpose? And for me, it's important to kind of cleanse yourself, to reinvent yourself through your own ways and understanding. But there's also a point where we cannot ignore it, because that would fall into a colourblind trap where, we just walk around playing the liberal humanist game. We're all humans. Okay, yeah, whatever that means, sure. But we're all humans in very different ways and experience very different things and have to endure very different responsibilities. So, sorry, I seem to always be given a yes or no answer.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
Philosophers, but I think it's important, crucial, it's necessary, but you have to really nail the reasons why you're doing it.
Yeah. Luke, I just want to pick up on something that Yaz just talked about, and it's this idea of colourblindness and the fact that some people say that I don't see colour, I just see a person. And I guess the problematic nature in that sort of erasure, the fact that there's this level of being uncomfortable with acknowledging that difference does exist. Your thoughts on that? I mean, what do you think when people say to you, I don't see colour, I just see a human being?
Go and see your optometrist if you don't see colour. And I think, it is these higher arching aspirations of, what you were hinting at the start, like what is the point of these categories and having these races? And, when we talk about so much of the Australian nation state being centred around whiteness, if we just took away all of that, it invariably leads to an assimilationist agenda. And I think, for my experiences as an Indigenous person, where so often people are like, you don't have to identify as Aboriginal, you can just be white if you want. And, in practical terms, I could if people didn't know me and I went in somewhere and just said, I'm not Aboriginal, no one's going to question that. But if I did that, I would, for my own sense of self and history and family, I would be validating a very active process of genocide. And so to not acknowledge where I come from and what was placed on my father and my family and that history, I couldn't ever imagine doing that. It to me isn't a choice. But in terms of like, that practical reality, like I could, yes, but I couldn't be me. I couldn't look myself in the mirror if I didn't. And it's also not how I see myself. Like I was raised, again, and just hearing you talk about those early experiences, like the way, and I don't remember this is a story that was told to me, but apparently when I was about 3 years old, I grew up on a 500-acre property, not a lot of Aboriginal people in the community, and I was watching F Troop. And I ran very proudly into the kitchen and said, when I grow up, I want to be an Indian just like Dad. And they were white people wearing freaking red face, but there weren't many Aboriginal people on TV when I was growing up. There weren't other people who looked like Dad for me to relate to go, that's what he is and I am and where I fit. And it was me saying that led to Dad saying to me at 3, like, son, you are Aboriginal. And I said, I don't remember that, but I don't ever remember anything else than being Aboriginal. And so to just say I'm white is not just like I practically could. It's not how I've ever perceived myself and related to my own identity or family. But at the same time, I do acknowledge like Mum is white and she is a part of me and I appear white. But again, I understand my own identity in that generational context of what happened with why Aboriginal people today, everyone else go, but I can say I'm half Chinese and half white, and that's not a problem. Why can't you? So it's like, because we have a very unique history of how our identities were categorised, classified, quantified, and then the implications of what that meant for us. And then also, historically, like even people like, there's been people who look like me who are Aboriginal for a very, very long time. Most of that 200-year history, it wasn't like white people didn't accept us. They knew we were Aboriginal because we were in these small towns where they knew who your mum was and they knew who your dad was. And so we've always been accepted within Indigenous communities far more than with white communities. And saying to fair-skinned Aboriginal people, you should be one of us, not one of them, is a very new thing. And it is not said in a welcoming way. Like it's not an invitation, hey, come on, you're cool. It's like, you can't be that. We're putting the label on you and telling you what you have to be and taking you out of where you've always been. And so...
What do you think that threat poses? I mean, like why do you think that's done? Is it to maintain power? Is it...
Yeah, well, I think it's that sense of entitlement that they have a right to. Like, and again, it's that very simplistic view, and like that history of while it was legislated, like who's an octoroon and who's a quadroon, who's a whatever, that wasn't done through anything other than at a quick glance. Like you look like you're an octoroon, you look like you're a quadroon, you look like you're a half caste. And talking again about that authentic image of any group, but with Aboriginal people, it's very much the Northern Territory image of Aboriginality, whereas like every other populated continent, like we have people who lived in the desert, people who lived in rainforest, people who lived in every environment. We didn't all, like pre-invasion, look like Northern Territory mob. Like my partner is obviously Aboriginal to look at, but is not as dark as other people. And so she gets all the time like, oh, you must have the one white parent, or you must have, you're a, and people try to quantify her. And she's like, no, I've got like both Aboriginal parents and all Aboriginal grandparents and have to go back a very long way in her family history to find a white person. But again, I think it's that white convenience of, I want to be able to look at you and put you in the box that I want to put you in. And when you don't go in the box that I thought you were in, that is an affront to my worldview of what you should be. And I actually feel confident enough to not go, oh, I was wrong, but no, you're wrong with who you are, and get over where I think you should be. And it's an amazing sense of arrogance and entitlement.
Mridula, just going back to this idea of celebrating difference and if it's about fostering inclusion, how we work through that when sometimes institutions will fall under the trap of using colourblind policies to kind of deem it as though it is inclusive because we're treating everyone equally. One of the examples that comes to my mind was just in the last year here in Victoria, some of the schools that had students from multicultural backgrounds enacted policies that they sort of said one size fits all, therefore all children should comply. And 2 young girls, black African girls, had braided their hair, and they were told by the school that it wasn't part of school policy, and therefore they had to unbraid their hair because no one's allowed to braid their hair. And I think the principal said, even students that come from Bali with their hair braided are forced to remove their braids. But then you've also got a situation where this is part of these young girls' culture and their heritage. And for many reasons, that's the only way that their hair can be, worked through for them to be able to go to school and all that sort of stuff. So how do we begin having these conversations about being inclusive, but also acknowledging that there's nothing wrong in celebrating difference? And if anything, it's a wonderful thing, whereas perhaps a one-size-fits-all policy leads to this erasure that just keeps happening over and over again.
I think this very idea of difference itself is an invention of colonialism itself. Because different from what? Different. There's a norm. There's a norm established which governs every aspect. Sorry, I was going to go off on a complete tangent. I think it's the ways in which subjecthood is created that becomes very important in questions the question that you're asking. So if subjecthood is created with a recognition that there are different kinds of human beings around, that there is a way in which things are on. If difference is something that is absolutely acknowledged as part and parcel of one's worldview, then you come up with a different kind of a scenario. But if difference is used in order to enforce the same colonial, capitalist management techniques, then it's a very difficult territory to work with. So there we have to work with, if we accept that those are the terms in which accept difference, then we have to combat it at those kinds of levels. Then we have to say there are 2 different kinds of multiculturalism. You can have a state-enforced multiculturalism, and you have something like a street-level multiculturalism, where that difference is part of how vibrant Melbourne is. When Australia advertises Melbourne or Sydney as really multicultural tourist destinations, those are the things that start getting celebrated. But if you want to control somebody through these kinds of machinations of power, whether it's through education, the legal system, through the workplace, then difference uses different kinds of managerial tactics. So I don't think I have a very, I don't have an answer to your question, but I think I might posit 2 different kinds of scenarios which come up through my experience. I've lived in Canada for 10 years, and then I've been in Australia for 10 years. And in Canada, what I found was that being different, labeled as a visible minority, was very difficult at the street level, but institutionally, it was much easier being in a white settler nation there, because public sphere and public dialogue around race was very vibrant. What I find in Australia is that it's much easier being a person of color at the street level, but racism is absolutely entrenched institutionally and structurally. So I think I can't begin to respond to your question about celebrating diversity, because celebrating diversity is for me, it's part of exoticization. I think to go to the heart of something being perceived as different is a political act. And that's the kind of work I think we have a long road ahead of us.
Yes, would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, there's parts that I'd like to, this conversation, I mean, I agree. But, as you were both speaking, the point about how difference is forced and made into this opposite to racism, when a big part of the history of racism was making difference. It's fascinating how whiteness inevitably reinvents itself to the point that now anti-racism has become more racist in many ways than racism, right? It's been dispossessed from people of color, and it's about centering white society and make them feel better about their presence. And even the fact that you have to speak in degrees and fractions of your, how indigenous you are is really because they're trying to disrupt the fact that you're proud of who you are. It's that the sheer absurdity of speaking of people in halves, Or, apes, like this is when these DNA tests that they're doing drive me crazy, because like all of a sudden you get this supposed reformed racist who found that he's 2% Turkish, and it's, wow, and I'm like, what's Turkish? But anyway, as you were speaking also, as you like talking about this kind of enforced, like one of the worst days of my calendar are supposedly the day that I'm supposed to be celebrated, Harmony Day. And I'm like, ya Allah, please make this day go quickly. And it's because I have to explain to my children. I don't want to tell them about the Sharpsville massacre. They're little kids, right? But it's another time. But now my kids are Eritrean, so next Harmony Day I'm going to dress them up as Killmonger from Black Panther. But it's this point where you have to force yourself to play in a particular way to kind of ease into this idea that now they accept whoever the they is.
I think that's part of my query, is that when we're thinking about how we begin to dismantle it, because you talked about just how entrenched racism is in institutions. So with the example that I gave, here was an institution thinking was doing a good thing, but by the very act was essentially perpetuating racism, because essentially they were saying to these girls, you can't be that, you have to be like this. And I guess what all of you are arguing is that people should be allowed to be everything that they are without having to question, explain, or conform to whatever the status quo thinks is acceptable. But how do you begin working through that when you're working through so much of this? I mean, I'll give an example. I was once told to straighten my afro. I did. Because for all sorts of reasons, I was told it was disheveled. I was told it was all doing all these sorts of things that didn't conform, and so I was asked to straighten it to fit a certain standard. And again, because we're talking about representation, I work in the media, I am visible. It was that idea of, if I don't behave in this certain way, I don't have my job, right? But my hair grows like an afro. It doesn't grow straight. So I guess in terms of when we're thinking about how these sorts of institutions think that they're doing the right thing by sort of enforcing a policy, that they're going, well, yeah, this works for this person, this person, this person, when in the process of doing that, they're erasing my own identity and my own way of being. I don't know if I'm articulating what I'm trying to get at the heart of when we're thinking about this.
But yeah, there's this kind of double bind that you want to reclaim your culture, yourself, but at the same time it falls into the trap of exoticizing or performing or, and even just rebuking, negating the negation. They say I'm this, I'm trying to be the opposite. It's this awful game that you can't win. And in this one way, sometimes there's the whole point I got from what your story you were telling, and also the horrible example of those two schoolgirls, where you just can't be yourself, whatever yourself is, right? Because you're either performing or not performing enough. And that's the point, I think, of trying to dismantle this white gaze. The whole point of anti-racism is to center people of color through people of color's conversations, but also the differences within the context of racism, the lateral violences that happen within. It can't happen. Your story makes sense on multiple levels, also on a visceral level, because I don't know what it means to be you, but I know what it means to be me, and continually have to kind of wear masks everywhere I go, because they're tied to economic, career well-being, right? So, it's an ongoing difficulties, but thankfully there are people that I can lean on, and hopefully you too.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, I could keep asking all three of you questions, but I'm going to open it up to the audience, because I'm sure they've also got some questions. So if anyone's got any questions for the panel, please put your hand up, and an usher will come to you with the microphone.
Hey, I have something that I think maybe I'll be curious to hear what your take is. I don't think I agree that it's easier to be a person of color on the street level, more so than institutionally. Maybe perhaps if you're a non-black person of color, maybe, because of the proximity to whiteness, I think. Because in my reality and many others around me, it's definitely different. The statement about the emphasis on visibility taking away from the right of people to choose who they are, well, I think it's crucial to understand why there's the emphasis in the first place. because visibility gets attacked so specifically, especially visible blackness, in an anti-black society. So it's important to recognize and name it that. Otherwise, we then risk invisibilizing each other, because it claims that realities of those most visible aren't authentic or they don't exist, because it is that visibility that we're attacked or brutalized for. So why often do we lean towards the emphasis, especially from non-black people in particular other non-black people of color, to make that claim? Because it becomes then another form of erasure, usually an erasure of that blackness.
Maybe I wasn't clear in terms of what I meant by invisibilization, hypervisibilization. I take it that's the question that you're asking?
I think it was when you gave the example that your experiences in Canada were different in that at a street level versus structurally, whereas here your observations were that it was easier to...
I think it goes to the question of political representation. So when you're dealing with machinery that is supposed to control your existence in the world that you live in, the comparison I made between Canada and Australia was because the level of public debate and public sphere, it was easier because there was language to put around it, there was naming to put around it. Whereas I find that to invoke even the R word in Australia is a battle in itself. So when I compare these two existences, I feel that there was a critical mass of dialogue that I felt that I could tap into in Canada. Whereas here I feel that there's a critical mass in terms of bodies, and here it's a very specific kind of body that I'm speaking. So in that sense, you're absolutely right. I'm speaking of this kind of critical mass of Asianness. And this is why I started with that kind of examination of one's own positionality. What is my positionality when I come as a South Asian migrant to a white settler nation? That's a very different equation. I agree with you, very different equation from somebody who is in this kind of an equation of the authenticity of blackness, who is more authentically black. I agree with that.
Can I just follow up on that and just ask Luke, I guess, to pick up on it in the sense of when we are having these conversations, and perhaps we might be heading into a flattening of experiences, when in the example that was cited in that question was that when you are hyper-visible in your blackness, there's no intellectual way of getting around that, because what you're getting back is something that you can't control, and so therefore the only way that you get a sense of power is by being able to name it, being able to call it something, being able to make sense of it. So how do we then think about it in this big structure of racism when there are these very first-hand encounters that people are facing, even perhaps by leaving today, there will be these very overt experiences of racism, and how to reconcile all of that?
I think, when we're talking about, getting back to the framing of this panel around like the labels, that discourse of like, I don't know that we've found, and so often we've come to like all of our answers sort of contradict themselves and are two things simultaneously, is understanding that we are probably never going to get a language that fully encompasses all the different experiences at all the times, but we can acknowledge those differences and we can improve it, and then every time we'll introduce new terms, we will find those lacking and wanting in other ways, and then we'll adapt those and we'll grow. But I think that big challenge has to be about not creating a set of language that talks about experiences that are, one, just simply not real, or two, that isolate, exclude or erase anyone's individual stories within that. And I mean, even when we talk about that concept of blackness and where we started talking about just that awkward reality in a lot of contexts where if it's like, Black Australians put your hand up and I do and you don't, that's a weird scenario that we have found ourselves in, but that is the reality of the existing dialogue that exists. But then even when we're talking about global blackness in Australian context, like the experiences of different black people in different spaces within Australia will be very different. Whereas, like an Aboriginal person in the Northern Territory who's living in the long grass, like there's no other any other black person in the world who'll be in the Northern Territory and be treated like that Aboriginal person will in those spaces. And then you can apply that locally and regionally and contextually, that no experience is the same as another. And then even then, an Aboriginal person in the Northern Territory who's wearing a suit and tie will get treated very differently to a fellow who's barefoot. And so I think the best we can do is try to have those understandings of where we're positioned within it, the experiences of other people within it, and when we're having these conversations, do our best to be respectful of those different experiences. And I just gave a couple of just off the top of head examples of, there are an infinite number of those in an infinite number of contexts. And I don't think we can, and I don't think the goal should be to come up with a set of language that will encompass all of that simultaneously. I think just that whole mindset of what's the right word for all of the things will fail.
First, I just want to thank you for your question. It was beautiful and powerful and very important. And I just want to respond to that. And it also put the spotlight on somebody like myself, and that's part of the importance. I would not be able to be articulating or speaking or thinking through these problems if I had not learnt and taken off Black feminists, Latino scholars, Indigenous scholars. And without any shadow of doubt, that has often encompassed my erasure of them unconsciously or otherwise, because I do not inhabit their body or spaces or community, or have to deal with the various different struggles that come from, specifically to Blackness, right? And I take the point that it's varied. So I think all I can say is to concede. Yes, they're often in the act of occupying spaces to deal with your own racism. One of the unfortunate consequences, not even unfortunate, it is a consequence of the kind of lateral violence that comes, and sometimes it's conscious, sometimes it's not, and I'm not making excuses for either or. That's why, without me saying X, Y, and Z, thank you for your question, and I think it's always important for that spotlight to be shone on the spaces upon which we discuss racism.
Thank you. Any more questions? Do we have? Okay. I have one question that I actually was going to ask you, Yaz, and this is this idea of race versus religion. Because I know in our context in Australia, if you are Jewish, you're considered a race. But when it comes to Islam, it's not seen as a race. And I know that because with Judaism, it was tested in the federal court, or Supreme Court, and it was found to be a race. So how do we, when we have conversations, people kind of go, oh, no, but when someone says something Islamophobic, they're not being racist, it's very different. How do we start unpacking that? But also this idea that within a religion, you have different races.
Yeah, there are multiple ways to unpack it. One is to unpack the very concept of race itself, what that means and how it's used. It reminds me of this protest at Penrith. It was in Penrith, I think there was a mosque being built, and of course everybody came protesting out, and they anticipated this. Islam is not a race placard, right? And ironically, they were dressed in what they think the Prophet Muhammad looks like, right? And it was funny that Islam's not a race, but you've raced your dress, right? You come out with your fake beard and it looked like a Sikh turban, but you won't get into the details. We'll go. So one aspect is unpack it, but also to bring it back to the fact that it is a power, and it goes back to your notions of technology and assemblages, that it's continually using and appropriating various notions in order to weaponize difference, weaponize similarities. And the Muslim as a category at an ontological universal level is in a sense that which is in submission, right? Which birds are Muslims, trees are Muslims, the universe is Muslim. On an ontic level, it speaks to a specific people and a group of people, and those people are diverse and in contest and in conversation. And so for me, it's always about the fluidity of these categories and their importance. When somebody is trying to say, I'm not a racist, I often switch off, right? Because that point, therefore, it's now about you and not the conversation about what's happening. If I adopt the role as an educator, and hopefully I'm being paid at that when I adopt that role, often I'm not, then for me, to answer your question in the shortest possible way, because we're running out of time, but it's simply about saying, well, what is race? Race inevitably is this kind of Frankenstein assemblages put together in order to make sense and maintain power, right? And also because power is always, the flip side of power is always fragile. It's always fragile. And so it cannot be made visible. So it is not a coincidence that often the ones who say Islam is not a race, they're at a protest saying no mosque dressed up as the Prophet Muhammad, right? It's not a coincidence. And I think that's more important to find out who's saying it for what reason.
I just want to, I know we don't have much time on it, but it's always been an interesting one, especially as that conversation with Islam has become more prevalent. And it is, it's every time it's used, it's a cop-out to say, I'm not racist and justify racism. But within the Indigenous context of that around spirituality is like, we don't get acknowledged as actually having religions in Australia either to begin with, but you know, there have always been non-Indigenous people who have gone through Indigenous business and picked up, you know, certain cultural rights and significance within that, and then that, you know, the political identity of race versus the spiritual identity of race and how that operates between, and you know, like I think every Aboriginal person has met a white person who's gone like, I was adopted into this group in the Northern Territory, or I got a skin name, or I've got this. But, you know, there have been interesting cases where I've met non-Indigenous people who have been through, you know, cultural law and then have gone, so can I now tick the box? And that's a fascinating space where you're like, one, why do you want to tick that box? But no, you can't, is the very short answer that I'll wrap on. But it just, for me, like, it's always interesting, that conversation, when it occurs, Aboriginality doesn't enter into it because we're not actually, just like we don't have a science, we don't have nations, we also don't have religion, which, yes, we do on all of those counts. And so, again, those labels of how much energy we put into going, like, we weren't just tribes, we were nations. We're not just spiritual, we actually had religions. And then that idea of the religious spiritual identity versus the political identity, the social, the community identity, the biological identity, like, it's just never ending.
Just very, very quickly, all three of you, final question. If people that are here today that are working through the labels, how they self-identify, what sort of advice would you give them in terms of working through this processes of trying to understand, unpack, unlearn, you know, the conditioning of a lot of these ideals? I mean, what would you get people to start thinking about and perhaps processing in their own spaces and in their own communities? I'll start with you, Mridula.
I think my first response to that would be I would think through complicities. And this is something that I've been thinking about, particularly in terms of people of color communities, which are often migrant communities in white settler nations. And I think the idea of complicities is really important to me because I come from a place where a particular religion has created an entire hierarchy which would be parallel to something like race, even before European colonizers came in. I refer to Hinduism, which comes up always as this kind of spiritual, kind of an beautiful thing, but entrenched within Hinduism is an entire system of putting people into caste categories, which would be very similar, but not coterminous with race. So I think the idea of complicities for me is very, very important, because when we talk of solidarities between different kinds of political work that we need to do, where we come from and the assumptions with which we've come to a new place becomes very important. And to start educating yourself through those complicities, I think as tips, reading groups are always useful, but it's also important to find people who are at different stages in that journey together. Okay. So, because if it's all going to be the attraction of the like, then it's probably not going to challenge us enough.
Yeah, Luke, very quickly, what?
I'd say, you know, be open to view yourself as a person on a journey and not be too worried about the finality of cracking the code and the right words. And, you know, for our context, it's always the ongoing debate between Aboriginal, Indigenous and First Nations, just as a really simple example. You know, for me, it's like I grew up with Aboriginal in the early 90s. Aboriginal academics introduced Indigenous to tap into the global Indigenous space. More recently, First Nations is becoming very prominent. And I used to have very strong opinions about that now I don't as much. Right. And I guess, you know, the big thing for me, I'd say, with anyone in those spaces is like you're saying, you know, everyone else is on their journey as well. And so when someone says, call me this and not that, I'm like, cool, I'll call you that and not that. When someone speaks on behalf of all Aboriginal, Indigenous, First Nations people and says, never use this word, only use that, I find that greatly problematic because there's someone else with a different opinion. And so respect that difference and be open to take on new information and change.
Great. Yes?
Yeah, don't blame yourself. Labels have a tendency for you to fall into a trap of questioning who you are. Be beautiful, be strong, be brave, count your bruises and be proud of the fight that you have. I've lived a long life of trying to fight this, and inevitably what a consequence of this is I felt an imposter and a failure and not succeeding at it. There is no solution to racism. There's only survival and resilience, and there's a beauty and there's honesty. And these are our lifeboats, and I think we need them, and I think we need to lean off people and lean off others, and we're going to have our darker moments, and we're going to have, how about that for, I was going to say lighter moments, how about for racializing? Ignore everything I've said.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on. So if you could all join me in thanking the panel.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.